My name is Sarah Calloway. I am 34 years old, and on a Tuesday morning in March of 2025, I sat at the head of a conference room table on the second floor of First Callaway Savings Bank on Elm Street, opened a leather portfolio, and looked across that table at my brother. He was wearing his best flannel shirt. He had a folder of documents pressed against his chest like a man holding the last thing he owns. He had driven 40 minutes to be there by 8:57 in the morning, and when the loan officer said my name and my title, he went completely still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of a man who has just understood something he cannot undo. I looked at him. He looked at me. The water pitcher between us had not been touched. I said, "Good morning, Thomas. I've reviewed your file. Shall we get started?" What he didn't know was that I had been building toward that room for 5 years, not for revenge, not for that moment, for something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. This is Dad's story. I grew up in a house on Birchwood Lane in Crestfield, Ohio. A brown and cream colonial with a covered porch, a maple tree in the front yard that turned orange every October, and a dinner table where certain people's voices carried further than others. My father, Robert Calloway, 61 years old now, built a modest construction business with his own 2 hands over 30 years, sold it at 58, and has lived comfortably on the proceeds ever since. He keeps a boat at Lake Erie. He drives the same pickup truck he has driven since 2009. He is the kind of man who believes love and money are the same currency and who spent most of his life making sure only one of his children ever ran out of either. My mother, Donna Calloway, 58, is a part-time bookkeeper with a Facebook page she updates every other day and a bumper sticker on the back of her Subaru that reads, "Proud Mom of a Veteran." My brother Thomas served 2 years. I graduated from Northwestern with a finance degree and built a career entirely from scratch, without a single check written on my behalf. The bumper sticker is only about Thomas. It has always only been about Thomas. Thomas Calloway is 37. He is charming in the way that men who have never been told no tend to be charming. He served, came home, learned contracting from our father, and started a small renovation business in 2017 that has never quite found its footing. He is married to Becky, who is 35 and genuinely kind, and they have 2 children who have nothing to do with any of this. Thomas is not a cruel man. I want to be careful about that. He is not the villain of this story in the way that people with torches and speeches are villains. He is something more ordinary and in some ways more damaging. He is the beneficiary. He received everything that was offered without ever asking why I was offered so much less. That is its own kind of harm. I have spent the last 10 years trying to identify the exact moment I understood what I was in my family. I think it was the summer I was 22, 3 months after I graduated. I had just accepted an entry-level analyst position at Kerrigan Financial Group in Columbus. It was a real job, a competitive job. I had applied to 14 firms and gotten 2 offers and chosen the better one. I came home for the 4th of July and my father said, at dinner, in front of everyone, "Sarah's going to sit at a desk and look at numbers." Good for her. He said it with the tone a person uses when they are trying to be generous about something they do not value. My mother smiled and passed the potato salad. Thomas said, "Hey, at least you'll have air conditioning." Everyone laughed. I laughed too because I had not yet learned that you are allowed to not laugh. When I was 26, I was promoted to senior analyst. I called home on a Thursday evening, 9:47 at night, after a dinner I had eaten alone at my desk because I had been working since 7 that morning. My mother said, "Wonderful sweetheart. Does that mean you can finally afford a nicer apartment?" I told her the apartment was fine. She said she had seen on Facebook that Thomas had just won a renovation contract for a community center in Sandusky. She talked about that for 11 minutes. I counted. In 2017, my father gave Thomas $47,000 to cover startup costs for his renovation business. Equipment, licensing, a used cargo van, a deposit on a small commercial space. I know the exact number because Thomas mentioned it at Easter that year, proudly, with no awareness that it was a number I would not forget. I had been building a modest portfolio by then, careful and deliberate, funding it entirely on my own salary. That same spring, I asked my father for $15,000, not a gift, a loan, with written terms I had already drafted, to accelerate the acquisition of shares I had been watching for 2 years. He looked at me the way he always looked at my plans, patient, politely unmoved. He said, "I'm not gambling on the stock market, Sarah. That's not real money." I thanked him and drove home and added $15,000 to my savings target for the following quarter. Then came Thanksgiving of 2019. There were 22 people at that dinner. I know because I set the table. My mother had put me in charge of the seating arrangement, which I had learned by then was her way of involving me without including me. I set 22 places, folded 22 napkins into fans the way my grandmother used to, and put out the good plates that only came out for the holidays. My father stood up after dessert. He was in a good mood. He had been in a good mood all day, the kind of good mood that, in our family, meant something had already been decided that the rest of us were about to find out about. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and produced 2 envelopes. He called Thomas to stand beside him. He put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. He said, and I am quoting him exactly because I have never forgotten a single word of this, "This house has been in our family since 1987. It belongs to you, Thomas. You've earned it. The house on Birchwood Lane, assessed at $340,000. Deed transfer, effective immediately. A lawyer had already been consulted. The paperwork was on its way." Thomas looked stunned. Becky put her hands over her mouth. The room made the sound rooms make when something large and real has just occurred. Then my father turned to me. He held out the second envelope with both hands, the way you hand something to a child. He said, "And Sarah, we're so proud of you, sweetheart. You've always figured things out on your own. That's your gift." Inside the envelope was a $200 gift card to Target. I did not cry. I did not make a sound. I sat with my hands in my lap and I smiled and I said, "Thank you, Dad." And then I picked up 3 empty dessert plates and carried them to the kitchen and stood at the sink for 63 seconds with the water running, which is long enough to feel everything you need to feel when you have decided you are never going to let anyone see it. 6 months after that dinner, I was at my parents' house for a Sunday visit. My mother was in the kitchen having coffee with her neighbor Patricia, and I had come in through the side door, which meant she did not hear me arrive. I heard my mother's voice from the hallway. She was saying, "Thomas needs the support. Sarah has always been fine. Some kids you just don't have to worry about. She'll land on her feet." Patricia said something I could not hear. My mother said, "She's strong. She's always been strong. It's just her nature." I stood in the hallway for a moment. I thought about the 22 napkins I had folded into fans. I thought about the word gift. I thought about the phrase "land on her feet," which is a thing people say about cats after they have dropped them. And then I went into the kitchen and hugged my mother and had a cup of coffee and did not say a single word about what I had heard. I drove home at 2:17 in the afternoon, and that evening I opened my laptop and began building something my family would never see coming. The company was called Meridian Capital Group. It was the parent company of First Callaway Savings Bank, the regional bank that held Thomas's mortgage on the house my father had just given him, the family business checking account my father had held for 20 years, and my parents' home equity line of credit. Meridian was a mid-size regional holding company, publicly traded, and in 2020 it was undervalued in a way that most people who do not spend their professional lives reading balance sheets would not notice. I noticed. I registered a Delaware LLC in February of 2020 under the name Hartfield Asset Management. I chose the name deliberately. Hartfield was my grandmother's maiden name. Nobody in my family knew that. Nobody in my family had asked. I began acquiring shares in Meridian Capital Group through a series of carefully structured investment vehicles, brokerage accounts, the LLC, a trust instrument I set up with an attorney in Columbus. I moved slowly. I moved quietly. I did not move in ways that would attract attention. By June of 2021, I held 4%. I kept going. By the end of 2021, 9%. By April of 2022, 15%. I was still going to family dinners. I was still passing the bread and clearing the plates. At Christmas that year, my father spent 45 minutes explaining to Thomas which subcontractors he should be using for a bathroom tile job. He did not ask me a single question about my work, not one. I said nothing. I drove home and bought more shares the following Monday. If you are still watching this, I need you to pause here for a moment, because what I am about to describe is not something I planned in anger. I want you to hear that clearly. I built this quietly, over years, not because I was trying to arrive at that conference room. I built it because the work was the only thing in my life that had ever been entirely mine. Nobody helped me start it. Nobody's name was on it. Nobody gave me a check with a speech attached. Whatever I built alone. And that made it real in a way that nothing else in my life had ever been. If this story is reaching you, if you are the one in your family who is always fine, always landing on your feet, always the one they don't have to worry about, I want you to drop a comment below and tell me what that has cost you. Because it costs something. It always costs something. By March of 2023, I held a 34% controlling stake in Meridian Capital Group. That made me the single largest individual shareholder in the company. In January of 2024, I was appointed to the board of directors as Regional Director of Asset Management. My name was in the board minutes. My name was in the SEC filings. All of it was completely, publicly available information. You could have found it with a 10-minute Google search. Nobody in my family ever looked. That year, I attended 4 board meetings. I flew to the regional headquarters in Cleveland on a Thursday morning in March, chaired a committee meeting on portfolio risk exposure, and flew home that evening. The following Sunday, I had Easter dinner at my parents' house, and my mother asked if I was seeing anyone. I said not at the moment. She said, "You're so focused on work." That's nice. I passed the deviled eggs and smiled. Thomas's renovation business had been struggling since late 2023. The contracts were inconsistent. He had expanded too fast, hired 2 additional workers he could not consistently pay, and taken on a commercial job in early 2024 that had gone significantly over cost. By the fall of that year, he was pulling from personal accounts to make payroll. By February of 2025, he was 4 months behind on the mortgage for the house my father had given him. The house valued at $340,000, with $287,000 remaining on the note. First Callaway Savings Bank initiated default proceedings on the 14th of February, 2025. Thomas called the bank 3 times in the following week. He was frantic in the way that people become frantic when something they were given and never had to earn begins to slip away. He arranged a loan modification meeting. He was told a senior director would be handling his case personally. He was given a date, March 14th, 2025. 9 a.m., First Callaway Savings Main Branch, Elm Street. He did not know the name of the director he would be meeting with until he was sitting in that conference room. I had not arranged it that way deliberately. That was simply how the scheduling worked. My assistant had handled the calendar. I had reviewed his file the previous evening alone in my office, a cup of tea going cold on my desk. The pages of his payment history spread in front of me. 4 months of missed payments printed in red. The renovation contracts that hadn't closed. The second mortgage inquiry from November that had been denied. I read every page of it. I read it the way I read every file. Carefully, completely, without skipping anything. I arrived at the branch at 8:44. I went to the second-floor conference room. I set my leather portfolio at the head of the table and poured a glass of water I did not drink, and stood at the glass wall looking out at the parking lot below. At 8:57, a familiar truck pulled into the lot. I watched my brother get out. He was wearing a flannel shirt, the dark green one he saves for occasions, and his good work boots. He had a manila folder pressed under one arm. He looked up at the building the way people look at buildings they need something from. I went back to the table and opened my portfolio. At 9:02, Janet Moss, the loan officer assigned to his case, knocked twice and opened the conference room door. Thomas was behind her. I was looking down at his file. Janet said, "Mr. Barrow, Callaway, this is Sarah. She's our regional director of asset management and will be personally overseeing your modification request." The silence lasted 5 full seconds. I counted them. Thomas said, "Sarah?" His voice came out wrong, too small for the room, too much air in it. I looked up. I said, "Good morning, Thomas. I've reviewed your file. Shall we get started?" He did not move from the doorway. Janet stood slightly to one side, her expression carefully neutral. The particular neutrality of someone who understands they have just walked into a room where something larger than a loan modification is taking place. Thomas said, "You work here?" I said, "I'm on the board. I've been on the board for 14 months. He came to the table slowly. He sat down across from me. He set his folder in front of him, but did not open it. He looked at my portfolio, then at the nameplate on the table, then back at my face. "You're in charge here?" he said. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the flannel shirt. I thought about the folder he had pressed to his chest in the parking lot. I thought about my father's voice saying, "That's your gift," and my mother's voice saying, "She'll land on her feet." I said, "Would you like some water before we begin?" He looked at the pitcher. He did not answer. So I turned the page in his file and I began. The modification meeting lasted 1 hour and 12 minutes. I walked him through the options: a 6-month forbearance period, a structured repayment plan, a term extension on the remaining balance. I spoke to him the way I speak to every client whose file I review. Clearly, completely, with the exact same tone I would use for anyone else sitting across that table. Janet took notes. Thomas answered my questions. By the end of the meeting, he had a viable path forward and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the 1st of April. He did not say anything personal during the meeting. He answered my questions about the business accounts and the outstanding invoices and the projected timeline for 2 pending contracts. He was, to his credit, prepared. He had done the work of preparing. The folder under his arm had been organized carefully, the documents in order. He had taken this seriously. It was only when Janet excused herself at the end and we were briefly alone in the room that he spoke outside the terms of the meeting. He said, "Sarah, I didn't know." I closed my portfolio. I picked up my coffee, which had gone cold. I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "Does Dad know?" I said, "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" I said, "Since 2020. He sat with that. He looked at the table. Then he looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry. About Thanksgiving. About all of it. I didn't know that what they gave me was, I never thought about what you didn't get." I held that for a moment, because it was true, and because it was the first time anyone in my family had said it, and because it had taken arriving in this room for it to become sayable. I said, "I know, Thomas. I'll see you on the 1st. He nodded. He picked up his folder and his jacket, and he walked out of that conference room, and I sat alone at the head of that table for a few minutes before my next meeting, the water pitcher still untouched between us. My father called 3 days later, Thomas had told him. My father's voice on the phone was different than it had ever been, quieter, slower, the confidence gone out of it the way air goes out of something that has been carrying too much weight for too long. He said, "Sarah, I had no idea. I had no idea what you were doing. I should have asked. I should have asked a long time ago." I was standing in my kitchen making tea. I said, "It's all right, Dad." He said, "It's not. What we did at that dinner, what we've always done, it was not fair to you. Your mother and I talked. It wasn't fair." I said, "No, it wasn't." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I said you were gifted at figuring things out on your own. I meant it as a compliment. I understand now that it wasn't." I thought about saying many things. About the $47,000 and the $15,000 he wouldn't lend me. About the bumper sticker and the dessert plates and the 63 seconds at the kitchen sink. About 22 napkins folded into fans for a dinner at which I received a Target gift card while my brother received a house. I didn't say any of those things. I said, "I appreciate that, Dad. I do." My mother called the following evening. She cried, which I had expected. She said she was proud of me, which I had not expected. She said she realized she had confused self-sufficiency with not needing anything, and that she had been wrong to make that assumption. She said she had taken down the Facebook post about Thomas's business and written a new one about me. I told her that wasn't necessary. She said she wanted to. I let her. I want to tell you what this story is not, before I tell you what it is. It is not a story about revenge. I did not build a company to destroy my brother. I did not acquire shares in that bank to humiliate my father. I did not arrange to be in that conference room for dramatic effect. The work I did was real work, built over real years, because it was the only territory in my life that had ever been entirely mine. Nobody gave it to me. Nobody's name was on it. Nobody handed it to me with a speech and a crowd of 22 witnesses. Whatever I made from silence, and from the very independence my family had praised me for, without understanding that they were the ones who had made it necessary. The lesson I carry is not that I won. I am careful about that word. I do not think of what happened as winning. I think of it as becoming the person I was building in the years when everyone around me had decided I was already fine, already figured out, already someone they didn't have to watch. My father once said I was gifted at figuring things out on my own. He was right. He just didn't know what I had figured out. What I have figured out is this: being overlooked is only a disadvantage if you accept the oversight as a verdict. I never accepted it. I took it as information, and I use that information the way I use every number I have ever been handed. Quietly, carefully, over time, until it became something no one could ignore. I still go to family dinners. I still set the table sometimes. The dynamics are different now, more careful, more attentive, the way rooms become attentive when someone who is underestimated reveals themselves. I do not love my family differently than I did before. I do not withhold warmth from them. I only moved to the seat where I could be seen. Thomas got his modification. His business has stabilized. He is not the villain of this story, and I do not want him to be. What I want is for the people watching this to understand that the one in your family who everyone calls resilient and independent and strong, that person did not arrive at those qualities by accident. They arrived at them because resilience was the only resource they were ever given. If that is you, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously before you answer. Not for me, for yourself. Have you ever been called independent as a way of being left behind? Have you ever been told you'll figure it out by someone who meant I am not going to help you? Have you ever set the table for a dinner where you already knew what was in the envelope with your name on it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.